Welcome to the Claville Report, a report that talks about law, policy, and politics. These three areas tend to dominate our lives every single day. This report was created to pull back the covers, eliminate the white noise, and understand the reasoning behind the world today. We're about giving you the facts from all sides and not personal opinions. We're not about what should be and should not be, but instead, we're about what is and what can be. And now, here's your host, E.W. Claville.
Hi, and welcome again to the Claville Report, Law, Policy, and Politics. And thank you for joining us for this edition, where we're going to discuss clogged pipes, how Washington really works. Now, if you're a student of politics like me, you've seen this happen over the course of decades. We have a situation where we have a good idea, a good bill, but the two sides start fighting. They can't agree on one provision here or one provision there that's buried in a multi-page, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages of policy in that bill. And we get the back and forth on the news stations. We get the back and forth on various interview talk shows. We get the back and forth now on social media, that engagement, and the back and forth in what we used to have quite often were town halls. Creating misinformation, creating more division, creating more disdainment and disgust for our great nation and how our nation works. But at the end of the day, the bills pass and we move on to something else. So the question becomes, why is that the case? Why does that happen? If eventually we get the bill passed, is it because we're creating these clogged pipes in order to get more seats in the House and the Senate? Are we creating these clogged pipes to discredit one party against the other? Are we creating these clogged pipes to create a wedge in the American citizenry so that you really don't know what's happening? You really don't read the bill thoroughly. And by the way, not too many people read those bills, but we do know that it does benefit the writers of those bills. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to start to take a look at some history here. We'll get into the recent developments of infighting and also cross-the-aisle fighting, and look at some solutions. So when we talk about clogged pipes, when we talk about how Washington does business, it's all about politics. And whether it's the Washington, whether it's the state government, whether it's your local government, or whether it's your local organization, and politics plays a part there. The old saying goes, it's like watching sausage being made. You don't want to watch it, but you love the end result. And that's very true. Politics behind the scenes is not for the faint at heart. It's definitely not for those that don't really see the long-term benefit in creating smart public policy and good public policy for the public. You know, it's almost like a sport that some of us enjoy all too well, and others, they could care less about it. And just like any sport, it has its spectators, it has its stakeholders, and yes, it has its winners and its losers. We've had many colorful fightings in political houses, whether they be in the state level or whether they be in Washington. Many eras where we've had politicians spar against each other. You know, what we would call maybe the golden era of Tip O'Neill during that time period as Speaker of the House, or maybe that era where we had Harry Reid in the Senate. And of course, Speaker Boehner, along with the Tea Party. Or we can look now where we currently have Speaker Pelosi and the job that she's done since she's been Speaker of the House to move agenda forward. And we can't forget about Mitch McConnell, or who I call Justice McConnell. If you looked at an episode previously where we highlighted his strategy in order to push Supreme Court justices across the aisle. So how does this thing actually get moving? What are the issues there? I want us to take a quick look at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's an article that you read. It talks about how to break polarizing gridlock and push for what they call big popular change. Now, one of the questions in this particular article, it talks about how do we help the system function? Or even before we get there, the question becomes, is this good for America? Does this create the gridlock, the polarization of issues? Does it create a sense of scarcity and pessimism about our American system? And if it does, how can we help the system function? Now, keep in mind, our American system of government, our democracy, it works. Yes, it is a two-party system. It's not parliamentarian, which, of course, we know across our mother, England and other countries and that they colonized that adopted that style, and others that adopted it without colonizing. There is a percentage of representation where everyone has a seat based upon your percentage and how many votes you win. And of course, you have the ruling party or the majority party at that time period that pretty much controls the agenda and also is the face of the government at that time. But in the United States, and of course, we're not totalitarian, it's not an anarchy, it's not a dictatorship, it's not a monarchy, but it is a democracy. Now, democracy, of course, is the youngest form of government of all those that I just named. It is one that is the most fragile because you have so many fighting special interests that are trying to get control of the government, trying to get control of the policy-making mechanism through only two parties. Yes, we do have third parties, but their success has not been as much. Of course, we remember Ross Perot, who's probably the best known for his third party run. Ralph Nader, also on the national level, has done and did a good job as far as turnout goes. But for the most part, we are under a two-party rule. So a lot of times, in order to create optimism as opposed to pessimism, we need some good policy that can go and fill up the halls and get past where it helps everybody. This article talks about passing a 50-state infrastructure bill, which we just passed. It also talks about creating values with family values tax credit, where we take a look at providing the opportunity to help and support working families, middle-class families. And this is attractive to everyone across the aisle. I don't care if you are what's called a red state, a blue state, if you're a blue-collar worker, or if you're an educator. Tax credits work. Tax credits help, and it gives value. It also talks about upskill America. Now, when we talk about upskill, one thing that we saw during the pandemic is the proliferation of AI. Artificial intelligence is here. Automation is here. It's not going anywhere. It's only going to control or be a part of our lives, more so. So a lot of jobs are going to become obsolete, or we'll have fewer people there. I know I get advertisements all the time of this one area of artificial intelligence, and that's in fast food restaurants, where now there are some things where you don't have to have a person making. You can have an AI, artificial intelligence, automation, machine over a grill, over the fries. And instead of having 6 people back there, 2 manning the grill, maybe 2 over the fries, whatever the case may be, and 2 fixing food or preparing it, you only need maybe 1 that's overseeing and managing, making sure that the automated service does their job. So how do we now help to combat against that? We help by simply providing an opportunity for citizens to receive the skills that they need to upgrade, to be a part of what's called the fourth industrial revolution, which is artificial intelligence. In addition to that, we see challenges ahead. And what are some of those challenges? Well, first of all, one of those challenges is that one side really doesn't want to give the other side a victory. But is it a victory for that special interest? Is it a victory for that party? Or is it a victory for America? When we have common sense public policy that helps everyone across the board, that is good policy. That is a win for America, the American people. But unfortunately, controversy sells, and controversy is very profitable across the board. We see it in our current popular culture. We see it on television. We see it in social media. Controversy sells. We see it in our written novels and in our written tabloids and the like. A lot of people buy stories, not because of their good stories or feel-good stories, but they buy it because it's a controversy. The same as in politics. We're always in politics, the controversy helps to create an advantage for you against your opponent. It also helps to provide that additional boost that you need when you're sinking in the polls. But once again, who is it good for? Is it good for that person that's seeking re-election in a district that's hotly contested for their personal interests? Or is it good for America? I will say this though, as relates to being a politician, I always tell those that I've worked on campaigns for, and those who are aspiring public servants, I tell them there are 3 rules to being an elected official. Number 1, get elected. Number 2, stay elected. And number 3, get reelected. Without those 3, you are no longer an elected official. So I understand from the standpoint of protecting yourself in order to play the game. Because if you're not in the game, how can you then be a part of it? But to what cost? So let's take a look at some recent legislation and some recent infighting, and across the aisle fighting. Let's take a look at 3. Let's take a look at, let's do 4. All right. Look at the first, infrastructure bill. Infrastructure bill passed over $1 trillion of investing in America's roads, highways, clean energy, also its broadband access, and safe, efficient drinking water. Who could argue with that? But you only had, well, first of all, let's look at the infighting. It's a good bill. It's a common sense bill. It's going to get America back to work. It's going to make sure that our cities have what they need in order for public transit. It's going to make sure that we cut our emissions to CO emissions in order to limit our carbon footprint. But there was an issue. We had 6 Democrats that actually voted against it. And these are what individuals have called the quote unquote progressive Democrats, also all part of what's called the popular name of the squad. These are individuals who were recently elected. We're talking of Representative Bowman out of New York, Bush out of Missouri, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Omar of Minnesota, Presley of Massachusetts, and Tlaib of Michigan. They voted against it. Here's a good bill. So why? Why vote against it? It's because they've called for both of the infrastructure package and what's called the Build Back Better Act to move together. In other words, it's the social policy safety net. In order to get the vote that they need or wanted at that time. But you had pushback. And keep in mind, the Democrats have majority in both houses, both the Senate and the House. But that was infighting that could have stopped this, where it did pause the bill, but it could have stopped it altogether. But it wasn't until you had 13 Republicans cross over that voted for the bill. Representative Bacon out of Nebraska, Fitzpatrick out of Pennsylvania, Garbarino out of New York, Gonzalez out of Ohio, Katko out of New York, Kissinger out of Illinois, Representative Nicole out of New York, McKinley out of West Virginia, Reed out of New York, Smith out of New Jersey, Upton out of Michigan, Drew out of New Jersey, and Young out of Alaska. They saw this as a good bill. Most of these representatives out of these states are getting some of the largest amounts of money from this bill. New York, Texas, and California are the three states that are getting the largest amount. And then you have other states that have a low, per capita, they're least populous, but per capita, they're getting more money than the states that were named previously, such as Montana, Vermont, and Alaska. Those states are getting more money per capita than all the other states. So they saw this as good policy. But what's the problem? Their own party, members of it, said that they should not have voted for it, that they should lose their seats, that they should be exiled, lose their committee assignments, all because they voted on good common sense policy that's going to help not just them, their constituents, but help our nation move forward, and not just move forward, but also compete on the world stage. Classic clogged pipes in Washington. It was a good bill, made good policy, but the intra-party fighting and then across the aisle fighting. That's what we saw that could have stopped this. This bill should have been a 100% yay in every house. Should have happened just like that. Keep in mind, it's the same bill that could not pass during the time of former President Trump because they didn't want to give the Democrats a win. That was it. It made sense, but it didn't make political sense, i.e., clogged pipes. Let's take a look at another bill, another example. None other than a Build Back Better Act. This social policy safety net, which is coming up now, it's in negotiations, and we see the infighting that's taking place in the cross-aisle fight. Because of what happened during COVID-19, the CARES Act we saw, which I believe, and I've said before, this podcast and other areas, is one of the smartest bills and I think one of the best bills that we've passed. It really helped to save our economy, save our country, and really save the world's economy. Because if America would have crashed, the world would have crashed due to our money being a reserve dollar currency of the world. And not only that, but also we are the number one economy. So it makes sense to help try to duplicate what the CARES Act did to help in social policy, to help provide paid leave for families that experience birth. We're the only industrialized country that don't do it. Provide universal pre-K. Studies have shown over and over again, if a child goes to pre-K, they have a huge percentage of likelihood to succeed as opposed to not. It just makes sense. Childcare, to provide these subsidies to allow parents to actually get out and work for those that want to do so. It makes sense. And also safety net for our senior citizens and safety net for our families as well. It makes sense, but clogged pipes, how are we going to pay for it? On one side. On the infighting, well, across the aisle. On the infighting, well, maybe this is too much. I don't feel comfortable. And we're not talking about a lot of people. We're talking about a few individuals that are stopping the progress of this. Well, let's look at another example and say, is this good politicking or is it hypocritical? I remember the prescription drug bill during the time of President Bush II. It was a bill that it just wasn't, at the time, it was the largest bill as relates to taking care of prescription drugs for senior citizens. And it was one of those bills that made sense, but we just couldn't pay for it. It was too big. It was going to add to the deficit. I mean, it was just not a good bill pay-wise. And of course, they were underestimating how much it would cost and all of that, as usual. I was watching. I was a student of politics. I was watching C-SPAN at the time, and I was watching the bill, the negotiation on the floor. And the bill, I went to bed close to midnight, or a little bit maybe after. The bill was dead. Woke up the next morning. The bill passed. There were some holdouts on the Republican side. And let's just say, after the conversation, the holdouts were no more holdouts, even though they believe, as I did, it wasn't a good bill because of the way it was paid for or not paid for. But you also have the tax cut, as an example, that was provided and pushed by the former Trump administration, and also signed on by a lot of Democrats, but not all, providing tax cuts to the top percentage of our country in the trillions, which would add literally $10 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. And I never forget, I was watching one of my favorite shows, David Rubenstein's conversation that he was having with Steve Mnuchin, who at the time was the Secretary of Treasury. And he was asking, how is this paid for? And he said, we are confident this will be paid for with 4% growth over time in the U.S. economy. And I paused. I said, well, I'm not an economist, but I did study economics in my program, political science program, public policy. So that doesn't make too much sense because you cannot pay for a bill or pay for any service based on confidence. I'm confident that a lot of things will happen. What does the evidence say? And I remember David Rubenstein kind of paused a bit, and that was it. I knew right then and there we were in trouble. This was before it passed. And of course, the CBO, their report came out, Congressional Budget Office, and it showed the amount of deficit it would add, but it still passed. Now, we're making an argument against social policy to help everyday working families, our senior citizens, that we should take care of, as opposed to passing with lightning speed a tax cut that the top percent only affected them with really voodoo economics that said that it would be paid for based upon not actual dollar figures, but on confidence of an economy growing. And then COVID. So you know where that went, right? Lastly, well, go figure. Hypocritical or not? We passed a prescription drug bill that wasn't paid for properly. We passed a tax cut bill that affect only a top percentage of our country, top 3%, that wasn't paid for properly. And we're making an argument against a social policy safety net bill, which we know these programs work because it's kind of a copycat from the CARES Act, from some provisions, but for the most part, to bolster our social safety net for our people, meaning the country, because it's too much or it's not paid for. Once again, infighting, across the aisle fighting, clogged pipes. And the last example is the Supreme Court nominations and Senate hearing and vote. Under Justice McConnell, Senator Mitch McConnell, like him, love him, don't like him, don't love him, whatever your disposition is about him, you got to respect him. You got to respect the way that he utilizes the rules of procedure, sets his goal, and get it done. Of course, the judiciary is something that he's eyed and targeted for years. And he was going to make sure he got it done. And he did. He got it done. Now, of course, you may not agree with the method. You may not agree with the message that it gives to current and future generations. Even some that have passed away may have a major disagreement with the way that it happened. But you got to respect it. He got it done. Was it hypocritical? Did it create disdainment for our system and how it works? Disdainment for our politicians? Yes, all of that. Did it clog the pipes up for a while? It did. Former President Barack Obama made a nomination to fulfill a seat with former federal judge, Merrick Garland, who is now our U.S. Attorney General. But that person was overlooked. And we did not have the traditional nine justices on the court that we had for cases that were being heard until someone else was brought in and nominated by the controlling party at the time. It was a big gamble. But it worked out for them as relates to their agenda. But was it good for America? Was it good for our politics? Was it good for our image? Politico.com magazine, they have this article that says how to fix gridlock. And here it says Congress is stuck. How can we jolt it into action or work around it? And it gives about 12, 13 actually. Let's see, is it 13? Yeah, 13 opinion articles. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm looking at some that I think are most important or salient in our discussion. But it points out 13 opinion articles where they give examples of what can be done. Harry Reid says, ditch the filibuster. Charles Koch says, start with problems, not parties. Tim Wu says we need a national ballot initiative. Jennifer Lawless said, end the permanent campaign. Kevin Kozar goes a conventional route, says a permanent committee to improve Congress. And Sanford Levinson says impeachment 2.0. In other words, the impeachment system is broken. Also, Robert George says return all legislative power to Congress. In other words, there are some areas where Congress themselves cannot, actually executive order creates legislation. For the most part, has a power legislation. In our polarized society or government, we've seen presidents actually legislate through executive order. It was never meant for that, but that's what's happened. And then finally, provide congressional bonuses on merit. Well, who's going to create that rubric in order to grade our U.S. congresspersons on? These are all ways for persons who are involved in government, serve in government, or involved in special interests that say that we can fix it. There's a book that's being published February 2022, and it really talks about how if we don't fix our system, what it will mean to the rest of the world. It's called Divided We Fall, and this is a book by Alice Rivlin, Sherry Rivlin, and Alan Rivlin. And it says that partisan warfare and gridlock in Washington threatens to squander American opportunity to show the world that democracy can solve serious economic problems and ensure widely shared prosperity. So they note that instead of working together on challenges ahead, such as aging workforce, exploding inequality, climate change, rising debt, what they foresee is that what we're witnessing, our elected leaders are sabotaging our economic future by blaming and demonizing each other in hopes of what? Of winning big in the next election. They argue that they are weakening America's capacity for world leadership in the case for democracy here and abroad. Now, this book, it's a 200-page read. They say that it's a practical guide for Americans across the political spectrum who are agonizing over partisan warfare, incivility, and policy gridlock. They're looking forward to ways they can help to get our democratic policy process back on a constructive track before it's too late. I'm anxious for this book to come out and take a look at is out of Brookinson Institution Press, February 22nd, 2022. But one thing that I've always said, and will continue to do so, America is the beacon of light for this world, our democracy. It's a standard, it's a great experiment that has worked so far. But nations usually fall first from the inside, not out. In order for us to save our democracy and ensure that this great experiment continues on and is duplicated across the world, we first have to save ourselves from ourselves. The question is, how do we do it before it's too late? We'll answer that question in other episodes. Thank you again for joining us for this episode of Claville Report, Clogged Pipes, How Washington Really Works. Until next time, be well.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Claville Report. Make sure you subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. For information or to connect with E.W. Claville, check out our website at www.theclavillereport.com. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to @The Claville Report on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. This has been the latest episode of The Claville Report. Until next time, be well.